The cranial nerves are 12 paired nerves that arise from the brain and travel through foramina and fissures in the cranium to innervate various structures, primarily in the head and neck. Just like spinal nerves, which originate from the spinal cord, cranial nerves originate from the brain, but unlike spinal nerves, which are pretty similar to each other, with all of them being mixed nerves, the cranial nerves are a mix and match of motor, sensory, and autonomic functions. Simply put, some cranial nerves are motor nerves, some are sensory nerves, some are mixed, and some carry parasympathetic fibers as well. Funnily enough, some of them aren't even nerves at all. The first and second cranial nerves, which are the olfactory and optic nerves, are actually brain projections that belong to the olfactory and optic tracts, but everyone likes to call them cranial nerves, so we will too. Let's start by naming the 12 pairs of cranial nerves in order from rostral, or front of the brain, to the caudal, or back of the brain, on an image of the ventral surface of the brain. First olfactory, second optic, third oculomotor, fourth trochlear, fifth trigeminal, sixth abducens, seventh facial, eighth vestibulocochlear, ninth glossopharyngeal, 10th vagus, 11th accessory, and 12th hypoglossal. There are many mnemonics out there to help you remember these, so choose one that best fits you, but here at Osmosis, we like to remember these nerves by saying O to touch and feel very green vegetables. Now, these nerves don't all originate from the same place, and they enter or exit at different parts of the brain. Cranial nerves 1 and 2 enter the cerebrum, but most of the cranial nerves enter or exit at various levels of the brainstem. Cranial nerves 3 and 4 emerge from the midbrain, and it's worth mentioning that cranial nerve 4 is the only nerve to arise from the dorsal aspect of the brainstem. Cranial nerve 5, or the trigeminal nerve, arises from the pons, while cranial nerves 6, 7, and 8 enter or exit at the pontomedullary junction. Lastly, cranial nerves 9, 10, and 12 all enter or exit from the medulla. Finally, cranial nerve 11 arises mostly from the spinal cord. Okay, now let's talk about the embryological development of the cranial nerves. See, way back when we all looked a bit like intrauterine shrimp, there were 6 sets of tissue bands called pharyngeal arches. Originally, there were 6 of them, numbered logically from 1 to 6. However, the 5th doesn't develop, so we are left with 5 pharyngeal arches numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. During development, each pharyngeal arch develops along with a cranial nerve or one of its branches, so whatever structure develops from a particular arch is innervated by the associated nerve. So the first arch is associated with the trigeminal nerve, or cranial nerve 5. This arch gives rise to the mylohyoid, tensor tympani, tensor villi palatini, the anterior belly of digastric, and the muscles of mastication. The second arch is associated with and innervated by the facial nerve, or cranial nerve 7, and gives rise to the stapedius, stylohyoid, posterior belly of digastric, and the muscles of facial expression. The third arch is associated with the glossopharyngeal nerve, or cranial nerve 9, and gives rise to the stylopharyngeus muscle. The fourth arch is associated with the superior laryngeal nerve, which is a branch of the vagus nerve, or cranial nerve 10. This arch gives rise to the cricothyroid muscle, cricopharyngeus, muscles of the pharynx except for the stylopharyngeus, and the muscles of the soft palate except for the tensor villi palatini. Finally, the sixth arch is associated with the recurrent laryngeal nerve, another branch of the vagus nerve, and gives rise to intrinsic muscles of the larynx, except for the cricothyroid muscle, and to the upper muscles of the esophagus. Now, to better understand the anatomy and function of the cranial nerves, let's think of the cranial nerves like tiny highways. Just like cars traveling along highways, information travels through the cranial nerves. This information can travel in one direction, or both. The 2 lanes that make up our cranial nerve highway are motor and sensory pathways. Motor fibers originate in the brain and carry motor signals from the brain to the structure they innervate, so they are referred to as efferent fibers, and to remember this, the E in efferent stands for exit. Sensory fibers carry signals in the opposite direction, from their receptors in the periphery to the brain, which is why they can be referred to as afferent fibers, with the A standing for arriving. Now, there are three types of motor fibers: somatic motor, which innervate striated muscles under voluntary control; somatic branchial motor, that can only be found in cranial nerves and innervate voluntary muscles that develop embryologically from the pharyngeal or branchial arches; and visceral motor, specifically parasympathetic fibers, which constitute the cranial outflow of the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system and innervate smooth muscle, glands, and the heart. As for the sensory fibers, there are also three types: somatic sensory, which carry sensory information such as pain, temperature, touch, and proprioception from the skin, mucous membranes, and muscles; visceral sensory, which carry information from the carotid body and sinus, pharynx, larynx, as well as thoracic and abdominal viscera; and lastly, special sensory, which is associated with smell, sight, taste, hearing, and balance. Now let's see what type of information each cranial nerve carries. Generally, cranial nerves will carry either motor information, sensory information, or both, making it a mixed nerve. Now, we have a good mnemonic to remember what type of information each cranial nerve carries. Some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. The 12 words correspond with cranial nerves 1 through 12. If it starts with an M, it carries only motor information. If it starts with an S, it carries only sensory information. And if it starts with a B, it carries both. It's worth noting that in addition to carrying somatic motor fibers as well as sensory fibers, there are 4 cranial nerves that also carry parasympathetic information, specifically the oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus nerves. Now, let's talk about the main functions of each cranial nerve. So, the olfactory nerve has a special sensory function and carries information about smell. The optic nerve is also special sensory and carries information responsible for vision. The oculomotor nerve has a somatic motor function as it innervates most of the extraocular muscles, which are responsible for movements of the eyeball. It also carries parasympathetic information to the sphincter pupillae muscle, which constricts the pupil, and the ciliary muscle, which alters the curvature of the lens. The trochlear nerve provides somatic motor innervation to one of the extraocular muscles called the superior oblique. The trigeminal nerve, as the name suggests, has 3 divisions: the ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular nerves. All 3 nerves carry sensory information from different parts of the face, scalp, and mouth. The trigeminal nerve also has a somatic motor function, as its mandibular division innervates the muscles of mastication that are responsible for chewing movements. The abducens nerve provides somatic motor innervation to one extraocular muscle called the lateral rectus. The facial nerve provides somatic motor innervation to several muscles, including the muscles of facial expression, and it also carries parasympathetic fibers for innervation of the submandibular, sublingual, lacrimal, and nasal glands. The facial nerve also has a sensory function as it innervates a small area of skin on the external ear. Finally, it also carries special sensory fibers that sense taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. The vestibulocochlear is a special sensory nerve in charge of hearing and balance. The glossopharyngeal nerve provides somatic motor innervation to the stylopharyngeus muscle needed for swallowing, while also carrying parasympathetic fibers to the parotid gland. It also carries sensory information from the oropharynx as well as the carotid sinus and carotid body, and finally it has special sensory fibers that sense taste from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. The vagus nerve provides somatic motor innervation to the muscles of the larynx and pharynx needed for phonation and swallowing. The nerve also carries parasympathetic fibers to the heart and lungs, as well as muscles and glands of the gastrointestinal tract and abdominal viscera. It carries sensory information from the larynx, pharynx, heart, lungs, and abdominal viscera. Finally, it has special sensory fibers that sense taste from the epiglottic region and laryngopharynx. The spinal accessory nerve provides somatic motor innervation to the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles. Finally, the hypoglossal nerve also has exclusively a somatic motor function as it innervates the muscles of the tongue responsible for tongue movements. As a quick break, let's try to label the 12 cranial nerves on this image of the undersurface of the brain. Alright, as a quick recap, here are the 12 cranial nerve pairs. Cranial nerve 1, or the olfactory nerve, cranial nerve 2, or the optic nerve, cranial nerve 3, or the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 4, or the trochlear nerve, cranial nerve 5, or the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 6, or the abducens nerve, cranial nerve 7, or the facial nerve, cranial nerve 8, or the vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 9, or the glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve 10, or the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 11, or the accessory nerve, and cranial nerve 12, or the hypoglossal nerve. They can carry different information: somatic motor, which innervates striated muscles under voluntary control; parasympathetic, which are visceral motor fibers that innervate involuntary structures like glands, smooth muscle, such as in the gastrointestinal tract, and the heart; and somatic branchial motor, that innervate voluntary muscles that developed embryologically from the branchial arches, also known as pharyngeal arches. Then there are somatic sensory, which carry pain, temperature, tactile, and proprioceptive impulses from the skin, mucous membranes, and muscle; visceral sensory, which convey sensory information from organs such as blood vessels, the gastrointestinal tract, and other thoracic and abdominal viscera; and lastly, special sensory, which is associated with smell, sight, taste, hearing, and balance. Finally, the cranial nerves all carry varying types of information, which we can remember by using our mnemonic. Some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. Furthermore, cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10 all serve as pathways for parasympathetic innervation, while cranial nerves 1, 2, 7, 8, 9, and 10 all carry special sensory information.
Not only are there 12 cranial nerves with unique functions, each cranial nerve also has its own unique pathway from where it begins to where it ends. All this information can surely make your brain explode, but we're going to break it down for you. Simply put, cranial nerves connect centrally to cranial nerve nuclei, which is where cranial motor nerves begin, or where cranial sensory nerves terminate. Remember, nerve fibers leaving the brain are considered efferent fibers, whereas nerve fibers entering the brain are considered afferent fibers. These centrally located nuclei contain the cell bodies of motor and sensory neurons of the cranial nerves, and the nuclei are where these neurons will synapse with the neurons of higher brain centers, such as the thalamus and the cerebral cortex. So, essentially, these nuclei act as a pit stop for the exchange of signals traveling between higher brain centers, such as our cerebral cortex, to all of the structures our cranial nerves go on to innervate, ultimately facilitating the function of the cranial nerves. This is important as the cranial nerves will carry different types of motor and sensory information, so the nuclei help organize all of this information. In short, cranial nerves can carry two types of motor information, the first being somatic and branchial motor information, and the second being visceral motor or parasympathetic motor innervation. Then there are the three types of sensory information, the first being somatic sensory information, the second is visceral sensory information, and the third is special sensory information. So we used the analogy before that the cranial nerve pathways are like highways. So, let's talk about these highways and how they transmit the information carried along cranial nerves from the brain centrally to our head, neck, and body peripherally. Let's begin by talking about the cranial nerves that carry somatic motor fibers and branchial motor fibers, which eventually go on to innervate voluntary muscles. Of note, the difference between somatic and branchial motor is that branchial motor fibers are just fibers that innervate structures derived from the pharyngeal arches, which are also sometimes called the branchial arches. So, if all information in our nerves is like cars traveling on a road, then it has to come from somewhere. First, there are upper motor neurons found in the motor cortex. Their axons start in either the left or right cerebral hemisphere, and decussate, or simply put, cross the midline, typically at the same level of their cranial nerve nuclei prior to synapsing. By decussating, these nerves can then go on to eventually innervate some structure on the contralateral side of the head. After decussating, they then synapse with the lower motor neuron found in the motor nuclei for each specific cranial nerve. These nuclei are centers where the upper motor neurons will synapse with the lower motor neurons, thereby connecting the higher functioning centers of the brain with the cranial nerves and their peripheral destinations. Overall, there are 5 somatic motor nuclei and 3 branchial motor nuclei. Each motor nucleus is made of the cell bodies of the lower motor neuron, and the axons of these lower motor neurons then exit the brainstem to make the motor fiber components of their respective cranial nerves. The cranial nerve will arise from the brainstem near their corresponding nuclei, so when it comes to the somatic motor nerves, they arise from the brainstem near the midline, because the somatic motor nuclei are located in the medial portion of the brainstem. To remember this, there's an M in motor to represent medial. Then, these cranial nerves carry their motor information to the muscles that they innervate. The association between a nucleus and the cranial nerve is easy to figure out, as most of the cranial nerve motor nuclei have the same name as a corresponding nerve. For example, the somatic motor nucleus for the oculomotor nerve is the nucleus of the oculomotor nerve. The other somatic motor nuclei are the nucleus of the trochlear nerve, the nucleus of the abducens nerve, the nucleus of the hypoglossal nerve, and the spinal portion of the nucleus of the spinal accessory nerve, which is not in the brainstem but lies in the gray matter anterior horns of the upper cervical spinal cord. When it comes to branchial motor nuclei, we have the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, the motor nucleus of the facial nerve, and the nucleus ambiguus, which corresponds to and receives information from the glossopharyngeal nerve, the vagus nerve, and the spinal accessory nerve. An example of a general overall motor pathway would be an upper motor neuron from the cortex sending a signal to the motor nucleus of the facial nerve, transmitting the signal to the facial nerve, which would act to close your eyes during a horror movie, which very well may be one of these osmosis anatomy videos on the cranial nerves. Next, we have visceral motor or parasympathetic nerve fibers. Now, with visceral or parasympathetic motor neurons, the pathway gets a bit tricky. There are 4 cranial nerves that carry parasympathetic information: the 3rd, 7th, 9th, and 10th. And the nuclei where the preganglionic nerve fibers come from are called the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, the superior salivatory nucleus, the inferior salivatory nucleus, and the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus, respectively. These contain the cell bodies of the parasympathetic preganglionic nerves. Their axons travel with the cranial nerve to their respective ganglia, where they synapse with the cell bodies of the postganglionic portion of the pathway, which will go on to provide autonomic innervation to things such as muscles and glands. So, looking at these 4 pathways, the Edinger-Westphal nucleus sends its preganglionic PNS fibers to synapse in the ciliary ganglion to innervate the sphincter pupillae muscle. The superior salivatory nucleus sends fibers to the pterygopalatine ganglion to innervate glands such as the lacrimal gland, and the submandibular ganglion to innervate salivary glands around the mouth. The inferior salivatory nucleus sends fibers to the otic ganglion to supply the parotid gland. And lastly, the dorsal motor nucleus of vagus sends its preganglionic fibers to the cardiac, pulmonary, and myenteric ganglia. As a note, don't confuse ganglia with the nuclei. Even though both are made of cell bodies, nuclei are in the brainstem, while ganglia are enlargements more peripherally along the cranial nerve. Think of them like rest stops along the cranial nerve highway. Now it's time to talk about the sensory information traveling along the cranial nerves, starting with how the sensory system is organized. It consists of 3 neuronal groups, the first being primary first-order neurons, such as those found within the sensory receptors in the skin, whose cell bodies are found within sensory ganglions, similar to the dorsal root ganglions found along the spinal cord. These first-order neurons are pseudo-unipolar, meaning that they have a single axon that has a peripheral process going from the sensory receptor, and an additional central process going to sensory nuclei in the brainstem. Second-order neurons then carry that information from the sensory nuclei in the brainstem to synapse in the processing areas of the brain, such as the thalamus. Finally, the third-order neurons carry information from areas like the thalamus to the cortex. Now, somatic sensory fibers carry information about pain, temperature, and tactile sensation, as well as proprioception from the skin of the head, the temporomandibular joint, and associated muscles. To understand this pathway better, let's use the trigeminal nerve as an example, as it is the major cranial nerve responsible for conveying sensory information. It carries most of the somatic sensory fibers from the head, and logically, cell bodies of these nerve cells are found in the trigeminal ganglion. So the information travels from the receptor in the skin via the peripheral process to the cell body in the trigeminal ganglion. Then it synapses with the second-order sensory neuron in one of 2 trigeminal sensory nuclei, the chief or principal sensory nucleus that receives tactile sensation, or the spinal trigeminal nucleus that receives pain and temperature sensation. Information may also go to the mesencephalic nucleus that receives proprioceptive sensation. Information then travels from these nuclei to eventually reach the cortex. Just like how the motor nuclei in the brainstem were found most medial, the somatic sensory nuclei in the brainstem are more lateral. Okay, that sums up the somatic sensory information. Now we can take a look at visceral sensory information, which is somewhat similar to somatic sensory information, but mainly conveys fibers from the mucosa of the pharynx, chemoreceptors, and thoraco-abdominal viscera. But again, we typically have the same sensory system organization with first, second, and third-order neurons. There are 2 cranial nerves involved with detecting visceral sensory information, the glossopharyngeal nerve and the vagus nerve. Just like with the trigeminal nerve, each of them has its own ganglion where pseudo-unipolar nerve cell bodies are located. But unlike the trigeminal nerve and trigeminal ganglion, these ganglia don't always have the same names as the nerves. So first off, visceral sensory innervation from the oropharyngeal mucosa, as well as pressure receptors from the carotid sinus and chemoreceptors from the carotid body, travel via peripheral processes that make up the glossopharyngeal nerve, whose cell bodies are found in the petrosal or inferior ganglion of the glossopharyngeal nerve, and then travel to the nucleus of the solitary tract. Next, visceral sensory information from the mucosa of the hypopharynx and larynx, chemoreceptors of the aortic bodies, and thoraco-abdominal viscera travels through the peripheral processes that make up the vagus nerve, whose cell bodies are found in the inferior ganglion of the vagus nerve, and through its central processes ends up, you guessed it, in the nucleus of the solitary tract. After synapsing with the nucleus of the solitary tract, second-order neurons take this information to the thalamus, where third-order neurons eventually carry this information to the cortex. Now, it's time to go through our last subject for this video, special visceral sensory information, which is the area of expertise for 6 cranial nerves, the olfactory, optic, facial, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, and vagus nerve. Recall that the first 2 nerves, olfactory and optic, are not really cranial nerves, but rather they are brain projections, which is why their anatomy is somewhat different. So let's start with the olfactory nerve. As with other sensory nerves, there are first-order neurons, but this time their bodies are not in a ganglion. They are bipolar, meaning that they have two extensions, an axon and a dendrite. Their cell bodies are found in the olfactory epithelium in the nasal cavity. They receive the information through dendrites, which are also in the olfactory epithelium. Their axons travel from the epithelium and make the olfactory nerve fibers, which pass through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone and synapse with the second-order neurons, called mitral cells, in the olfactory bulb. Now, axons of the second-order neurons make the olfactory tract, which goes to the parts of the brain called the amygdala and uncus, which are involved in olfactory processing and emotions. Now it's time for the optic nerve. Just like with the olfactory nerve, primary first-order neurons are bipolar. They are found in the part of the eye called the retina, where they synapse with the second-order sensory neurons called ganglion cells. Now, axons of the ganglion cells form the optic nerve, which eventually synapse in the lateral geniculate body of the thalamus and end up in the primary visual cortex of the brain. Another famous special sense is taste. This information travels with 3 different cranial nerves depending on the area where the taste buds are located. So taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue and the palate travel through peripheral processes that course with the facial nerve, whose cell bodies are found in the geniculate ganglion, which then proceed through its central process to synapse in the nucleus of the solitary tract. Special sensory information from the taste buds on the posterior third of the tongue will travel with the glossopharyngeal nerve, whose cell bodies are found in the petrosal ganglion and travel to the nucleus of the solitary tract. Finally, other taste buds in the area of the epiglottis and pharyngeal region travel with the vagus nerve, where again, the cell bodies are found in the inferior ganglion of the vagus nerve and whose central processes end up in the nucleus of the solitary tract. And finally, now for the vestibulocochlear nerve. This cranial nerve travels through the internal acoustic meatus, where it separates into 2 nerves, the vestibular nerve and, wait for it, the cochlear nerve. The vestibular nerve carries information about motion and position from the semicircular canals and vestibular apparatus. Once again, there are bipolar nerve cells, whose cell bodies are located in the vestibular ganglion. The peripheral processes of these neurons receive information from their hair cells in the vestibular apparatus, and the central processes continue as a vestibular nerve to end up in the vestibular nuclei in the medulla and pons. The cochlear nerve is somewhat similar, but it carries auditory information from the hearing receptors in the cochlea. Again, there are bipolar nerve cells whose peripheral processes receive information from hair cells in the cochlear duct. Their cell bodies are located in the cochlear ganglion or spiral ganglion, and the central processes continue as the cochlear nerve to end up in the cochlear nuclei in the medulla. Okay, as a quick break, can you remember which cranial nerves carry motor innervation, sensory innervation, or both? What about parasympathetic or special sensory innervation? Alright, as a quick recap, cranial nerves are composed of efferent fibers leaving the brain and afferent fibers entering the brain, both of which carry information either to or from central nuclei, mostly located in the brainstem. Nuclei are clusters of cell bodies found centrally in the brainstem, whereas ganglia are nerve swellings containing clusters of cell bodies found along the peripheral nerves. These cranial nerves carry many types of information. Cranial nerves carry somatic motor and branchial motor information, which go on to innervate voluntary muscles. They can carry visceral or parasympathetic motor neurons to provide autonomic innervation to things such as muscles and glands. They also convey somatic sensory information about the outside world, sensing things such as pain and temperature, as well as visceral sensory information, which carries sensory information from areas such as the pharynx mucosa and thoraco-abdominal viscera. And finally, they have special sensory functions, which transmit information on things such as taste, smell, sight, balance, and sound.
The cranial nerves are made up of sensory fibers, motor fibers, or both, that innervate the majority of structures in the head and neck. In addition to general sensory and motor innervation, they also transmit unique sensations via special sensory fibers. You know these as taste, smell, sight, and hearing. So, to stop and smell the roses, but also to see the roses, we need to focus on the olfactory and optic nerves, also known as cranial nerves 1 and 2. So first, there's cranial nerve 1, or the olfactory nerve, which only contains special sensory fibers responsible for the sense of smell. These fibers transmit olfactory impulses from the olfactory epithelium of the nasal cavity to the brain, where they are perceived as the sense of smell. Now, the olfactory epithelium is located on each side of the roof of the nasal cavity, where the nasal mucosa contains olfactory receptor neurons. Olfactory receptor neurons are bipolar neurons that each have a dendrite on their apical surface that gives rise to many olfactory cilia, which possess receptors for odorant molecules. The basal surfaces of these neurons give rise to central processes, or axons, that are collected into bundles to form approximately 20 olfactory nerves on each side, that together we call the right and left olfactory nerves. The fibers pass through small foramina in the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone and enter the olfactory bulb in the anterior cranial fossa. Here, the olfactory nerve fibers synapse on second-order neurons, called mitral cells. The axons of these cells form the olfactory tract, which travels posteriorly to several olfactory areas, including the primary olfactory cortex within the temporal lobe. Moving on to cranial nerve 2, or the optic nerve, which is another special sensory nerve that transmits visual impulses from the retina to the brain. Now, the optic nerve is a paired extension of the forebrain, so it's actually CNS fiber tracts formed by axons of retinal ganglion cells with their cell bodies located in the retina. The optic nerve starts when the retinal ganglion axons pierce the fibrous external coat of the eyeball posteriorly, also known as the sclera, on its way to the brain. Now, the nerve passes posteromedially in the orbit, exiting through the optic canal to enter the middle cranial fossa, where it communicates with the other optic nerve to form the optic chiasm. Chiasm means crossing, and sure enough, fibers from the medial half of each retina cross into the chiasm and join fibers from the lateral halves of the retina that do not cross over to form the optic tracts. This crossing of optic nerve fibers in the chiasm is what allows us to have binocular vision, which is the ability to focus on an object with both eyes, and allows us depth of field perception, which is also known as 3D vision. So, before the optic chiasm, there are the optic nerves which carry sensory fibers from the medial and lateral areas of their respective retina. After the optic chiasm, there are the optic tracts. Specifically, the right optic tract transmits impulses from the left visual field, while the left optic tract transmits impulses from the right visual field. Most fibers in the optic tract terminate in the lateral geniculate bodies of the thalamus, and from here, the axons are relayed to the visual cortices of the occipital lobes of the brain. Alright, as a quick recap. The first cranial nerve, or the olfactory nerve, is a special sensory nerve which contains sensory fibers that transmit impulses from the olfactory epithelium of the nasal cavity to the brain, where the perception of smell occurs. The second cranial nerve, or the optic nerve, is a special sensory nerve that transmits impulses from the retina to the brain, which allows for vision.
Imagine a world where we had no control over the movements of our eyes. We would have to move our entire head in that direction to look at something new, something that would surely cause neck issues when playing video games. Luckily, we do have control over our eye movements, and the cranial nerves which innervate the extrinsic ocular muscles that move the eyeball are the oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens nerve, or cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6. First up, the oculomotor nerve has two main motor functions, a somatic motor function and a visceral motor or parasympathetic function, and there are different motor nuclei that control these two functions. So, the somatic motor function is controlled by the oculomotor nucleus, which is located in the midbrain, and the visceral motor function is controlled by the visceral motor accessory nucleus, or Edinger-Westphal nucleus, also located in the midbrain. The oculomotor nerve innervates 4 of the 6 extraocular muscles, namely the superior rectus, medial rectus, inferior rectus, and inferior oblique muscle. Thanks to this cranial nerve, we can direct our gaze superiorly, inferiorly, and medially. The oculomotor nerve also innervates the levator palpebrae superioris muscle, which lifts the superior eyelid. Parasympathetic innervation is provided through the ciliary ganglion to the smooth muscle of the sphincter pupillae, which causes constriction of the pupil, and to the ciliary body, which produces accommodation for near vision by relaxing the lens and allowing it to become more rounded. Now, the oculomotor emerges from the midbrain, pierces the dura mater lateral to the sellar diaphragm, or diaphragm sellae, and then runs through the roof and lateral wall of the cavernous sinus, and the oculomotor nerve enters the orbit through the superior orbital fissure. At this point, it divides into a superior division to innervate the superior rectus and levator palpebrae superioris muscles, and an inferior division to innervate the inferior rectus, medial rectus, and inferior oblique muscles. The inferior division also carries visceral efferent fibers to the ciliary ganglion, where they synapse. Postsynaptic fibers from the ciliary ganglion pass to the eyeball in the short ciliary nerves to innervate the ciliary body and the sphincter pupillae. Now, the optic nerve and the oculomotor nerve work together for 2 reflexes of the eye, which are the pupillary light reflex and the accommodation reflex. The optic nerve serves as the sensory or afferent pathway, and the oculomotor serves as the motor or efferent pathway. The pupillary light reflex is a reflex that controls the diameter of the pupil in response to light. When light enters either retina, it is sensed by the optic nerve, travels to the optic chiasm, then to the optic tract. The optic tract then sends a signal to a nucleus located in the midbrain called the pretectal nucleus. This nucleus then sends signals to both the right and left Edinger-Westphal nuclei located in the midbrain, and those signals travel along preganglionic parasympathetic fibers that exit with the oculomotor nerve and synapse with postganglionic parasympathetic neurons in the ciliary ganglion. Postganglionic nerve fibers leave the ciliary ganglion via short ciliary nerves to innervate the ciliary sphincter pupillae muscle of the iris to cause constriction. Therefore, shining a light in either eye should cause a reflexive constriction of the ipsilateral pupil called the direct pupillary light reflex, as well as the other pupil as well, called the consensual pupillary light reflex. This pupillary reflex is meant to constrict the pupil when there's plenty of light, so as to prevent more light from reaching the retina, and the strength of this reflex is dependent on the intensity of the light shining into the eye. The accommodation reflex, on the other hand, refers to the change in the shape of the lens of the eye in response to focusing on an object near or far away, similar to how a photographer changes their lens to take pictures on their camera. Like the pupillary reflex, the accommodation reflex has a sensory or afferent limb represented by the optic nerve and a motor or efferent limb represented by the oculomotor nerve. Now, this pathway starts with light hitting the retina, sending signals through the optic nerve, the optic chiasm, the optic tract, the lateral geniculate body, the optic radiation, and the visual cortex. After this long and winding road, signals are sent through the efferent limb of the pathway. First, they reach the superior colliculus in the midbrain, then the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, which sends signals to both the right and left oculomotor nerves and the parasympathetic nerve fibers that travel with the oculomotor nerve. The parasympathetic fibers synapse in the ciliary ganglion, then send ciliary nerves to the sphincter pupillae to contract the pupil, and to the ciliary body, which causes a sphincter-like contraction around the lens, which reduces tension and relaxes the lens, causing it to become thicker and more rounded. So, overall, during accommodation on objects close to our face, our pupils constrict, and our lens becomes thicker and more rounded. And when focusing on objects far away, our pupils dilate and our lens is thinner because it's under more tension. Alright, now the trochlear nerve, or cranial nerve 4, is the smallest cranial nerve, and its only function is to provide motor innervation to one of the 6 extraocular muscles, the superior oblique muscle. Its nucleus is called the trochlear nucleus, and it's located in the midbrain. The trochlear nerve is the only cranial nerve that emerges from the posterior surface of the midbrain and has the longest course. The trochlear nerve pierces the dura mater at the margin of the tentorium cerebelli and passes anteriorly in the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus. It enters the orbit through the superior orbital fissure. The trochlear nerve supplies the superior oblique muscle, which abducts, depresses, and medially rotates the eye. To remember what the trochlear nerve innervates, remember trochlear means pulley in Latin, and that the superior oblique muscle passes through a structure called the trochlea, using it as a pulley for leverage when contracting. And finally, there's the abducens nerve, or cranial nerve 6, which also innervates a single extraocular muscle, the lateral rectus muscle. The abducens nucleus is located in the pons, and the nerve emerges from the brainstem between the pons and the medulla. Each nerve then pierces the dura to run the longest intradural course within the cranial cavity of all the cranial nerves, eventually passing through the cavernous sinus. It enters the orbit through the superior orbital fissure, running on and penetrating the medial surface of the lateral rectus muscle, which abducts the eye to direct the pupil away from the nose. Alright, as a quick recap, cranial nerve 3, or the oculomotor nerve, has 2 functions. A somatic motor function controlled by the oculomotor nucleus located in the midbrain, and a visceral motor or parasympathetic function controlled by the Edinger-Westphal nucleus located in the midbrain. The oculomotor nerve provides motor innervation to 4 of the 6 extraocular muscles: the superior rectus, medial rectus, inferior rectus, and inferior oblique, as well as to the levator palpebrae superioris muscle, and also provides parasympathetic innervation to cause constriction of the sphincter pupillae and ciliary body. The oculomotor nerve, along with the optic nerve, ensure the functioning of 2 important reflexes of the eye: the pupillary light reflex, which controls the pupil diameter in response to light, and the accommodation reflex, which helps change the lens shape to focus on objects at different distances. Cranial nerve 4, or the trochlear nerve, innervates the superior oblique muscle, and cranial nerve 6, or the abducens nerve, innervates the lateral rectus muscle. When it comes to the trigeminal nerve, or cranial nerve 5, tri means 3, so right off the bat you can tell that the trigeminal nerve has 3 major branches: the ophthalmic nerve, or V1, the maxillary nerve, or V2, and the mandibular nerve, or V3. The ophthalmic and the maxillary nerves only have sensory functions, while the mandibular nerve has both sensory and motor functions. So, the trigeminal nerve is in charge of sensation for the face, mouth, nasal cavity, and dura mater of the cranial cavity, and also of motor functions like biting and chewing. In addition to motor and sensory fibers, postganglionic parasympathetic fibers join many of the branches of the trigeminal nerve to reach their final destination, so the branches of the trigeminal nerve serve as a pathway for parasympathetic innervation. Now, the trigeminal nerve emerges from the lateral aspect of the pons by a large sensory root and a small motor root. The large sensory root mainly consists of cell bodies of the pseudo-unipolar neurons that make up the sensory trigeminal ganglion, which sits within a dural recess lateral to the cavernous sinus called the trigeminal cave. When the ophthalmic, maxillary, and sensory component of the mandibular nerves detect a signal from their sensory nerve endings, the pseudo-unipolar neurons that make up these nerves transmit their signal through the trigeminal ganglion as first-order neurons in the pathway to synapse in the different trigeminal nuclei located along the brainstem. The cell bodies of these pseudo-unipolar nerves are located in the trigeminal ganglion, similar to how the dorsal root ganglions hold the cell bodies for the sensory pseudo-unipolar neurons of the body. After synapsing in the trigeminal nuclei, the second-order neurons cross the medial plane at the level of the pons and descend as the trigeminal lemniscus to synapse again in the contralateral thalamus to third-order neurons. These third-order neurons then travel through the internal capsule and go on to synapse in the cerebral cortex of the postcentral gyrus, where the sensory information is received and interpreted by our brain. Now, regarding the motor component of the trigeminal nerve, first-order neurons from areas such as the cerebral cortex of the precentral gyrus travel through the internal capsule and typically cross the median plane at the level of the pons to synapse in the trigeminal motor nuclei with second-order neurons located in the pons of the brainstem. These second-order neurons then exit and pass inferior to the trigeminal ganglion to form the motor component of the mandibular nerve. The motor fibers blend with the sensory fibers of the mandibular nerve as the nerve traverses the foramen ovale in the cranium. Eventually, these motor branches innervate the muscles that help with mastication. The trigeminal nerve has 4 nuclei. 1 motor, called the trigeminal motor nucleus, and 3 sensory, the mesencephalic nucleus, the principal sensory nucleus, or the pontine nucleus, and the spinal trigeminal nucleus. Each sensory nucleus receives a different type of information. So, the mesencephalic nucleus is located in the lower midbrain and receives proprioception for masticatory muscles, and it also senses deep pressure, which prevents you from biting down hard enough to lose a tooth. The principal sensory nucleus, which is located in the pons, receives tactile information from the face and mouth. Finally, the spinal trigeminal nucleus extends down the medulla and into the spinal cord and receives pain and temperature information from the face. All these nuclei also receive somatic sensory information from other cranial nerves that carry somatic sensory information, such as cranial nerves 7, 9, and 10. Let's take a quick break and try to identify the trigeminal nerve and its 3 major branches. Now, let's take a look at the first branch of the trigeminal nerve, which is the ophthalmic nerve, or cranial nerve V1. It originates from the trigeminal ganglion in the middle cranial fossa and passes anteriorly through the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus. Then it divides into 3 branches, all of which pass through the superior orbital fissure to enter the orbit. The frontal nerve, which then provides sensory innervation to the forehead and scalp, the lacrimal nerve, which supplies the lacrimal gland, and the nasociliary nerve, which supplies the eye and nose. Overall, the ophthalmic nerve transmits sensory fibers from the eyeball, the skin of the upper face and anterior scalp, the lining of the upper part of the nasal cavity and air cells, and the meninges of the anterior cranial fossa. And now for the specifics. The frontal nerve passes along the roof of the orbit and divides in 2 branches, the supraorbital nerve and the supratrochlear nerve. The supraorbital nerve passes through the supraorbital notch along with a branch from the ophthalmic artery and supplies the skin of the forehead and the scalp. The nasociliary nerve passes through the superior orbital fissure within the common tendinous ring and gives off 4 branches, the long ciliary nerve, the short ciliary nerve, and the anterior and posterior ethmoidal nerves. The long and short ciliary nerves supply the eyeball, while the short ciliary nerves also carry postganglionic parasympathetic fibers from the Edinger-Westphal nucleus of the oculomotor nerve to the ciliary body and sphincter pupillae. The preganglionic parasympathetic fibers travel with the oculomotor nerve and synapse in the ciliary ganglion. The ethmoidal nerves give sensory fibers to the meninges of the anterior cranial fossa and then supply the upper part of the nasal cavity and to the external tip of the nose, as well as the sphenoid and the ethmoidal air cells. The lacrimal nerve supplies the lacrimal gland and a small area of the adjacent skin and conjunctiva. The lacrimal nerve also carries postganglionic parasympathetic fibers from the pterygopalatine ganglion to innervate the lacrimal gland, which synapse with the preganglionic fibers originating from the superior salivatory nucleus and travel with the facial nerve. Now, the nasociliary branch of the trigeminal nerve, along with the temporal and zygomatic branches of the facial nerve, collaborate for two reflexes, the corneal reflex and the lacrimal reflex. In these reflexes, cranial nerve 5, or the trigeminal nerve, is the sensory or afferent pathway, while cranial nerve 7, or the facial nerve, serves as the motor or efferent pathway. The corneal reflex, also known as the blink reflex, refers to involuntary blinking that happens when the cornea is stimulated by a foreign body or a bright light, like when a grain of sand gets in your eye or when someone is pointing a flashlight at your eyes. The stimulus is sensed by the nasociliary nerve, travels to the ophthalmic nerve, and then to the principal sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve located in the brainstem. This nucleus sends signals to the facial motor nucleus to begin the efferent portion of the reflex and synapses with the facial nerve on each side. Then, the facial nerve activates the orbicularis oculi muscle, which contracts and causes the eyelid to close. So this reflex protects the eyes from foreign bodies and bright lights. The lacrimal reflex has the same afferent pathway as the blink reflex, and the efferent pathway starts with the preganglionic parasympathetic fibers that travel through the facial nerve to synapse in the pterygopalatine ganglion. The fibers then travel through various branches to reach the lacrimal nerve, which innervates the lacrimal gland, initiating tear production. Let's take another break and see if you can recognize the ophthalmic nerve and all its branches. Moving on to the second branch of the trigeminal nerve, which is the maxillary nerve, or cranial nerve V2, which transmits sensory fibers from the skin of the face between the palpebral fissure and the mouth, from the nasal cavity and the sinuses, and from the maxillary teeth. From the trigeminal ganglion, cranial nerve V2 passes in the lower part of the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus, goes through the foramen rotundum to the pterygopalatine fossa, and divides in two major branches: the infraorbital nerve and the zygomatic nerve. But it also gives smaller branches like the nasal, greater and lesser palatine, and pharyngeal nerves, which supply the nose and the palate. The infraorbital nerve branches from the trigeminal nerve to enter the pterygopalatine fossa. Then it passes through the inferior orbital fissure and runs anteriorly within the infraorbital groove of the orbital floor, where it gives off three superior alveolar nerves, which are sensory branches for the maxillary sinus and teeth. Then it enters the infraorbital canal within the floor of the orbit and exits through the infraorbital foramen, giving off branches that supply the skin of the medial cheek, the lateral nose, and the upper lip. The zygomatic nerve, on the other hand, arises in the pterygopalatine fossa and enters the orbit through the inferior orbital fissure. Then it runs in the lateral wall of the orbit, where it divides into two small cutaneous branches: the zygomaticotemporal nerve and the zygomaticofacial nerve, which supply the skin over the zygomatic and temporal bones, or more simply, the cheek and temple. The zygomatic nerve carries postganglionic parasympathetic nervous system, or PNS, information to the lacrimal nerve as part of the lacrimal reflex, while its preganglionic fibers travel with the nervus intermedius and then the greater petrosal nerve before they synapse in the pterygopalatine ganglion. The nasal branches pass medially from the pterygopalatine fossa through the sphenopalatine foramen into the nasal cavity, where they supply the nasal cavity and the sinuses. They also carry postganglionic parasympathetic fibers from the pterygopalatine ganglion to the nasal glands. The superior alveolar nerves pass directly through the maxilla to supply the maxillary teeth, gums, and sinus. The greater and lesser palatine nerves provide innervation for the hard and soft palate and also carry postganglionic parasympathetic fibers from the superior salivatory nucleus and pterygopalatine ganglion to the minor salivary glands located in the palatal mucosa. The pharyngeal branch passes posteriorly to contribute to the sensory supply of the nasopharynx. Now, don't forget, along with sensory information, there is also special sensory information of the head. Special sensory information, such as taste, passes from the taste buds on the palate through the palatine nerves, which pass through the pterygopalatine ganglion without synapsing, then go through the pterygoid canal, and finally hitchhike with the greater petrosal nerve back to the facial nerve. The facial nerve ultimately takes this information back to the brainstem to be processed. That was enough for now. Take a break and try to identify the maxillary nerve and all its branches. And now let's look at the third branch of the trigeminal nerve, which is the mandibular nerve or cranial nerve V3. The mandibular nerve has both sensory and motor functions. Specifically, it has sensory fibers for the skin over the mandible, the side of the cheek and temple, the oral cavity, the external ear, the tympanic membrane, and the temporomandibular joint. Its motor fibers go to the 8 muscles derived from the first pharyngeal arch. Remember that the pharyngeal arches are 6 embryological structures, of which only 5 eventually develop into the muscles, arteries, bones, and cartilage of the head and neck. Interestingly enough, each pharyngeal arch is typically associated with a cranial nerve innervating it, so for the first pharyngeal arch, that nerve is the trigeminal nerve. Now, the 8 muscles are the temporalis, the masseter, the medial and lateral pterygoids, the mylohyoid, the anterior belly of the digastric, the tensor tympani, and the tensor veli palatini muscle. To remember these, think of the 4 groups of 2. 2 tensors, 2 pterygoids, 2 big muscles, the temporalis and the masseter, and 2 muscles in the floor of the mouth, the mylohyoid and the anterior belly of the digastric. Alright, now, from the trigeminal ganglion, the mandibular nerve passes through the foramen ovale and then through the infratemporal fossa, where it gives off 4 branches: the inferior alveolar nerve, the lingual nerve, the auriculotemporal nerve, and the buccal nerve. Now, the inferior alveolar nerve gives off a branch called the nerve to mylohyoid, which supplies both the mylohyoid muscle and the anterior belly of the digastric. Then it passes through the mandibular foramen to enter the mandibular canal, where it gives off sensory branches for the lower teeth. Anteriorly, the nerve gives off the mental nerve, which exits the mandible through the mental foramen to supply sensation to the chin and the lower lip. The lingual nerve travels along the floor of the mouth and provides sensory innervation to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue and floor of the mouth. The lingual nerve also carries preganglionic PNS information from the superior salivatory nucleus, which initially travels with a branch of the facial nerve called the chorda tympani, and finally to the lingual nerve, where the fibers synapse in the submandibular ganglion. Then the postganglionic parasympathetic fibers innervate the submandibular and sublingual glands. Speaking of which, chorda tympani also conveys taste information from the tongue back to the solitary nucleus in the brainstem. Taste information from the taste buds of the anterior 2/3 of the tongue and oral cavity travels through the lingual nerve and then through the chorda tympani, which joins the lingual nerve in the infratemporal fossa, back up to the facial nerve, and eventually to the nucleus of the solitary tract in the brainstem. The next branch of the mandibular nerve is the auriculotemporal nerve, which arises distal to the foramen ovale and encircles the middle meningeal artery. It supplies the temporomandibular joint, the parotid fascia, the skin of the temple, and most of the skin of the external auditory meatus and tympanic membrane. It also carries preganglionic parasympathetic information that starts from the inferior salivatory nucleus, then travels with the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is cranial nerve 9. The PNS fibers synapse in the otic ganglion, located in the infratemporal fossa, while postganglionic fibers travel with the auriculotemporal nerve to innervate the parotid gland. The buccal nerve branch passes between the two heads of the lateral pterygoid muscle and underneath the temporalis and masseter muscle to give sensory fibers for the skin and mucosa of the cheek. Time for another break. Try to identify the mandibular nerve and all its branches. Finally, the mandibular nerve has somatic motor function and gives off branches for the four muscles of mastication, which are the temporalis muscle, the masseter muscle, the lateral pterygoid muscle, and the medial pterygoid muscle. These upper motor neurons begin in the cerebral cortex, where they go and synapse in the trigeminal motor nucleus in the pons of the brainstem to the lower motor neurons. From here, these fibers bypass the trigeminal ganglion and merge with the sensory component of the mandibular division. Then, after exiting from the foramen ovale, the mandibular nerve sends off motor branches to the four muscles of mastication. Finally, let's look at the jaw jerk reflex, where the afferent and efferent pathways are both carried out by the mandibular nerve. This reflex is used to assess the function of the trigeminal nerve and also to determine the level of a potential CNS lesion. The afferent pathway is sensed via the muscle spindles from the masseter muscle, and the sensory information then travels to the mesencephalic nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. Then, this primary neuron synapses in the trigeminal motor nucleus, where a signal is sent through the motor fibers of the mandibular nerve via the masseteric nerve to contract the masseter muscle, closing the jaw. Alright, as a quick recap, the trigeminal nerve is the fifth cranial nerve and provides both sensory and motor functions, while also serving as a highway for parasympathetic innervation. It has three major branches: the ophthalmic nerve, or V1, the maxillary nerve, or V2, and the mandibular nerve, or V3. The trigeminal nerve has four nuclei, one motor called the trigeminal motor nucleus, and three sensory, the mesencephalic nucleus, the principal sensory nucleus, or the pontine nucleus, and the spinal trigeminal nucleus. The ophthalmic nerve has three branches: the frontal nerve, the lacrimal nerve, and the nasociliary nerve. The frontal nerve divides into the supraorbital and supratrochlear branch. The nasociliary nerve gives off four branches: the long and short ciliary nerves and the anterior and posterior ethmoidal nerves. The nasociliary nerve, along with the temporal and zygomatic branches of the facial nerve, work together for two reflexes: the corneal reflex and the lacrimal reflex, and it's also important in carrying parasympathetic innervation to the ciliary body and sphincter pupillae, as well as the lacrimal gland. The maxillary nerve divides in two major branches: the infraorbital nerve and the zygomatic nerve, and also gives other branches such as the nasal, superior alveolar, greater and lesser palatine, and pharyngeal nerves, which service as a parasympathetic pathway for the lacrimal, nasal, and palatal salivary glands. The mandibular nerve is a mixed nerve providing both sensory and motor functions. It gives off four branches: the inferior alveolar nerve, the lingual nerve, the auriculotemporal nerve, and the buccal nerve, and provides motor function to the four muscles of mastication, which are the temporalis muscle, the masseter muscle, and the medial and lateral pterygoid muscles. It helps serve as a pathway for the special sense of taste, and also carries parasympathetic innervation to the parotid, submandibular, and sublingual glands.
Humans can make thousands of expressions with their faces, and this is possible thanks to the seventh cranial nerve, also known as the facial nerve. The facial nerve does much more than just control our facial expressions, though. It also plays an important role in salivating, sensation for some parts of the skin, and it's even involved in the perception of taste. The facial nerve has many functions, including somatic sensory, special sensory, branchial motor, and visceral or parasympathetic motor innervation. Parasympathetic innervation travels with the facial nerve to glands such as the lacrimal gland, nasal gland, palatal mucosal glands, and submandibular and sublingual salivary glands. It provides special sensory innervation to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, as well as somatic sensory innervation for a small portion of skin at the ear and external tympanic membrane. Now, where did the facial nerve come from? The facial nerve actually originates from a structure that begins to appear when you're about the size of a poppy seed, known as the second pharyngeal arch. Remember, the pharyngeal arches are 6 embryological structures, of which only 5 eventually develop into the muscles, arteries, bones, and cartilage of the head and neck. Many structures are derived from the second pharyngeal arch, such as the lesser horn of the hyoid bone, the styloid process, the stylohyoid ligament, and the stapes. Importantly, the stylohyoid muscle, the posterior belly of the digastric muscle, the stapedius muscle, and the muscles of facial expression are also derived from the second arch, which means they are all innervated by the facial nerve. Now, the upper motor neuron of the branchial motor pathway for the facial nerve starts from the motor cortex, and its axons travel through the internal capsule to eventually reach the facial motor nucleus located in the ventrolateral part of the pons, where it synapses with the pathway's lower motor neuron. The lower motor neuron has axons that pass dorsally, or posteriorly, in order to get around the abducens nucleus in the pons. Then, they continue their journey ventrally, or towards the front to exit the pons through its ventral side. These axons form the motor component of the facial nerve, which provides innervation for the muscles of facial expression, like that confused expression we all make when hearing about upper and lower motor neurons for the first time. Let's look at the course of the facial nerve and its branches, which begin intracranially and eventually emerge from the cranium to continue extracranially. So let's begin with the intracranial course. The facial nerve emerges from the junction of the pons and medulla, referred to as the pontomedullary junction, as 2 divisions: a large motor root, as we mentioned before, and a smaller root called the nervus intermedius, which carries taste, parasympathetic, and somatic sensory fibers. The 2 roots cross the posterior cranial fossa and then enter the petrous temporal bone via the internal acoustic meatus. Almost immediately after entering the internal acoustic meatus, the nervus intermedius joins the motor root, and together they take a sharp turn and enter the facial canal, which is located along the medial wall of the tympanic cavity. At this bend, there's an important structure known as the geniculate ganglion, which is where the cell bodies of the first-order sensory fibers of the facial nerve are found. Furthermore, instead of traveling through the facial canal, other fibers are given off forming the greater petrosal nerve, which travels anteriorly to provide parasympathetic innervation to the nasal, palatine, pharyngeal mucus, and lacrimal glands. Now, back to the facial nerve within the facial canal. It gives rise to 2 other branches: the nerve 2 stapedius, which provides motor innervation to the stapedius muscle, a small muscle in the middle ear, and the chorda tympani, which branches off before the facial nerve exits the cranium at the stylomastoid foramen, and eventually exits the cranium and goes on to innervate the tongue. Finally, the facial nerve exits the facial canal through the stylomastoid foramen and begins its extracranial journey. Once the facial nerve exits the stylomastoid foramen, it gives off the posterior auricular nerve, which wraps around the posterior aspect of the ear and continues to provide motor innervation to the occipital belly of occipitofrontalis, stylohyoid, and posterior belly of the digastric muscle. Additional cutaneous branches also provide somatic sensory innervation to a small area around the ear and external tympanic membrane. The sensory nerve endings from this site take the somatic sensory information through the geniculate ganglion, where its cell bodies are, and the axons continue along the nervus intermedius of the facial nerve. From here, the information passes to the spinal trigeminal nucleus, where it synapses with the second-order neuron, and then travels to the thalamus to synapse with the third-order neuron, which will bring the information to the cerebral cortex, where it's processed. Finally, the motor component of the facial nerve enters the parotid gland, where it forms the parotid plexus. Remember that even though the facial nerve passes through the parotid gland, it doesn't actually innervate it. Instead, the parotid gland is innervated by the glossopharyngeal nerve, or ninth cranial nerve. Within the parotid gland, the facial nerve wraps up its journey by splitting into 5 terminal branches: the temporal nerve, the zygomatic nerve, the buccal nerve, the marginal mandibular nerve, and the cervical nerve. And these branches are responsible for innervating the muscles of facial expression. A way to remember these branches is by using the mnemonic, "To Zanzibar by motorcar." Let's take a quick break and try to identify all branches of the facial nerve. Now, the facial motor nucleus has a dorsal and a ventral part. The dorsal region of the facial motor nucleus controls the muscles of the upper face, so it's hard at work when you're paying attention and raising your forehead muscles. This region receives innervation from upper motor neurons in both the right and left hemispheres of the brain, meaning it's under both contralateral and ipsilateral control. The ventral region controls the muscles of the lower face, so it helps you smile. This region receives upper motor neuron innervation only from the opposite hemisphere, meaning it is under contralateral control. This correlates with the clinical consequences of an upper or lower motor neuron lesion. In an upper motor neuron lesion of the facial nerve, the upper facial muscles are mostly unaffected, because they're under bilateral cortical control. So, if the fibers from one side of the brain are lesioned, they still receive innervation from the upper motor neuron in the other hemisphere, so that the muscles of the upper face won't be affected. However, this is not the case for the lower facial muscles, which are only under contralateral control. This means that the muscles of the lower face on the contralateral side of the upper motor neuron lesion will be affected. In a lower motor neuron lesion of the facial nerve, things are a bit different. That's because the fibers that come from the upper motor neurons decussate, which is a fancy way to say they cross over to the other side just before they synapse in the lower motor neurons. From the lower motor neuron, these fibers travel on the ipsilateral side, meaning the right lower motor neuron controls all the muscles on the right side of the face and vice versa. So a lower motor neuron lesion will lead to a complete lower motor neuron lesion of the facial nerve on the same side, regardless of which part of the facial nucleus was involved. This type of lesion is known as a facial palsy. Now that we've discussed the motor pathway of the facial nerve, let's look at one of the reflex pathways it's involved in. Like any other reflex, we have an afferent sensory pathway, which senses information, and an efferent motor pathway reacting to that information. In the corneal reflex, also known as the blink reflex, the trigeminal nerve is a sensory or afferent pathway, while the facial nerve serves as a motor or efferent pathway. The corneal reflex refers to involuntary blinking that happens when the cornea is stimulated by a foreign body in order to protect the eye, like when a grain of sand gets in your eye. The stimulus is sensed by the nasociliary nerve, where it then travels back to the ophthalmic nerve, cranial nerve 5, part 1, and then to the spinal trigeminal nucleus located in the brainstem. This nucleus sends signals to the facial motor nucleus on each side to begin the efferent portion of the reflex. From there, the facial nerve sends a signal to the orbicularis oculi muscle, which contracts and causes the eyelid to close. The facial nerve also provides parasympathetic innervation to the lacrimal glands, nasal glands, palatal mucosal, submandibular, and sublingual salivary glands, as well as special sensory innervation to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue and palate. All of these pathways begin as presynaptic or preganglionic fibers from the superior salivatory nucleus, which is located in the pons, and travel through the nervus intermedius. From here, each pathway the parasympathetic nerves take to reach the different glands is a little bit different. So let's first look at the pathway for parasympathetic innervation to the lacrimal gland. From the nervus intermedius, these fibers travel through the greater petrosal nerve to synapse in the pterygopalatine ganglion, also known as the sphenopalatine ganglion, located in the pterygopalatine fossa. The postsynaptic or postganglionic fibers then travel through the zygomatic nerve, a branch from cranial nerve 5, part 2, to reach the lacrimal nerve, a branch from cranial nerve 5, part 1, which innervates the lacrimal gland, initiating tear production. Parasympathetic innervation to the nasal glands and palatal mucosal salivary glands also travel from the nervus intermedius to the greater petrosal nerve and synapse in the pterygopalatine ganglion. However, the postganglionic fibers travel with the nasal and palatine nerves, branches from cranial nerve 5, part 2, to innervate the nasal glands and the palatal mucosal salivary glands. Lastly, parasympathetic innervation to the submandibular and sublingual glands travels from the nervus intermedius to the chorda tympani, where these fibers then travel along with the lingual nerve, a branch from cranial nerve 5, part 3, and eventually synapse in the submandibular ganglion, which is located inferior to the lingual nerve. Postganglionic axons innervate the submandibular and sublingual glands. Now, don't forget that the facial nerve also provides special sensory information, specifically taste, to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue and palate. Taste information from the taste buds of the anterior 2/3 of the tongue travels through the lingual nerve and then through the chorda tympani, which travels along with the lingual nerve in the infratemporal fossa, back up through the geniculate ganglion where their cell bodies are, and the axons continue to travel with the nervus intermedius of the facial nerve. Eventually, these fibers reach the nucleus of the solitary tract in the brainstem to synapse. On the other hand, the special sensory information from the taste buds on the palate are a bit different, and it is carried by the palatine nerves. These fibers pass through the pterygopalatine ganglion without synapsing. Then, they go through the pterygoid canal with the greater petrosal nerve and pass through the geniculate ganglion where their cell bodies are. Then, this information travels within the nervus intermedius to the nucleus of the solitary tract, where the fibers will synapse. Alright, as a quick recap. The facial nerve is the 7th cranial nerve, and it has 4 functions: somatic sensory, special sensory, branchial motor, and parasympathetic. It innervates the structures derived from the second pharyngeal arch, and it's formed by 2 roots, a large motor root and a smaller root called nervus intermedius. In its intracranial course, it gives off 3 branches: the greater petrosal nerve, the nerve stapedius, and the chorda tympani. In its extracranial course, it gives off the posterior auricular nerve, various motor branches, and 5 terminal branches: the temporal nerve, the zygomatic nerve, the buccal nerve, the marginal mandibular nerve, and the cervical nerve, which innervate the muscles of facial expression. The facial nerve also provides parasympathetic innervation to the lacrimal glands, nasal glands, palatal mucosal glands, submandibular and sublingual salivary glands, as well as special sensory innervation to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue and palate.
Do you know that feeling when you listen to your favorite song and you start dancing along? Well, you can thank the 8th cranial nerve for that. CN8, or the vestibulocochlear nerve, transmits special sensory information related to balance and hearing, from the inner ear to the brain. The vestibulocochlear nerve emerges laterally at the cerebellopontine angle, which is the junction between the pons, medulla, and cerebellum. Once it emerges from the cerebellopontine angle, it enters the internal acoustic meatus, where it separates into its two branches, the cochlear nerve and the vestibular nerve. The cochlear nerve carries information about hearing, and the vestibular nerve carries information about movements of the head, which aids in balance. Now let's look at the pathway of sensory information, starting with the auditory pathway. This begins in the cochlea, which is a bony tube that spirals on itself, resembling the shape of a snail shell. If we uncoil the structure and look within it in cross-section, there are 3 fluid-filled cavities called the scala vestibuli, the cochlear duct, and the scala tympani. The scala vestibuli is connected to the middle ear through the oval window and contains perilymph. The cochlear duct is filled with endolymph and houses the organ of Corti, which is our organ of hearing and contains our hearing receptors, or hair cells. Finally, the scala tympani is connected to the middle ear through the round window, and it also contains perilymph. The auditory pathway does begin in the cochlea, but first the sound waves have to get from the outside world to the cochlea, and this requires the help of some very small structures. The sound vibrations first travel through the external ear and vibrate the tympanic membrane, which sends a cascade of vibrations through the ossicles in the middle ear, which eventually transmit these vibrations against the oval window. When these vibrations hit the oval window, they transfer over to the perilymph inside the scala vestibuli, forcing the perilymph fluid into motion. Vibrations are then transferred to the cochlear duct, which contains the organ of Corti. The organ of Corti contains inner hair cells that activate in response to these vibrations and generate action potentials. These action potentials travel to the spiral ganglion. The spiral ganglion contains the cell bodies of the first-order bipolar neurons of the cochlear nerve. These bipolar neurons then send central projections that form the cochlear nerve, which transmits signals to the cochlear nuclei located in the medulla, which synapse with second-order neurons in the sensory pathway. From the cochlear nuclei, the neurons pass bilaterally to both the inferior colliculi, located in the midbrain, and to the medial geniculate bodies, located in the thalamus. The inferior colliculi are important relay centers in the auditory pathway. They process auditory information by discriminating pitch, rhythm, and the specific location of a sound, and then they send projections to the medial geniculate bodies. The medial geniculate bodies are where synapsing with third-order neurons occur, and from here, these third-order neurons travel to the auditory cortex within the temporal lobe, where the sensory information is processed for us to interpret. Okay, let's move on to the vestibular pathway, which carries information related to motion and position. This pathway also begins in the inner ear, specifically bipolar neurons originating from the hair cells of the vestibular apparatus. The vestibular apparatus is composed of 3 semicircular canals and the utricle and saccule. All these elements deal with different aspects of motion. The vestibular hair cells of the utricle and the saccule detect linear movements of the head, while the vestibular hair cells of the 3 semicircular canals detect rotational movements of the head. From the vestibular apparatus, the vestibular hair cells send information along the vestibular nerve to the vestibular ganglion, which contains the cell bodies of the bipolar first-order neurons of the vestibular nerve. From here, signals are sent along their central processes, which synapse in the vestibular nuclei of the pons and medulla or in the cerebellum. From the vestibular nuclei, the second-order neurons project to a number of places. One of the vestibular nuclei sends ascending fibers through the medial longitudinal fasciculus, or MLF, to the motor nuclei of the extraocular muscles. This allows the vestibular nerve to coordinate the movement of the head and eyes. Some nuclei send descending projections to form the medial and lateral vestibulospinal tracts to maintain posture and balance. Other nuclei project to the ventral posterior nucleus of the thalamus, where they synapse with a third-order neuron of this pathway, which then projects to the cerebral cortex to allow for the conscious awareness of the body in space. These nuclei may also project to the vomiting center in the medulla, which is why some people get carsick. All right, as a quick recap, the vestibulocochlear nerve is the eighth cranial nerve, CN8, and transmits special sensory information related to sound and balance from the inner ear to the brain. It has two branches, the cochlear nerve, which carries information about hearing, and the vestibular nerve, which carries information about balance.
The glossopharyngeal nerve is the ninth cranial nerve, and it has several roles. From helping us taste a freshly picked strawberry on the back of the tongue through its special sensory role, to keeping the carotid sinus in the loop about blood pressure variations through its visceral sensory component, as well as providing branchial motor innervation to a muscle in the pharynx and parasympathetic innervation to the parotid gland. It may also receive somatic sensory information from a tiny part of skin on the external ear. But this isn't important to remember. This nerve is working 4, sometimes 5 jobs, and doing them all really well. But now, where did the glossopharyngeal nerve come from? The glossopharyngeal nerve actually originates from a structure called the third pharyngeal arch that forms during intrauterine life, when the embryo is roughly the size of a poppy seed. Remember that the pharyngeal arches are 6 embryological structures, of which only 5 eventually develop into the muscles, arteries, bones, and cartilage of the head and neck. Now, the third pharyngeal arch is less complex than the first 2 and gives rise to only a few structures such as the common carotid artery, the proximal portion of the internal carotid artery, the lower body and the greater horn of the hyoid bone, and the stylopharyngeus muscle. All of these structures are innervated by the nerve of the third pharyngeal arch, which is the glossopharyngeal nerve. So let's take a closer look at the roles of this nerve. First up, there's the special sensory component that picks up taste information from the taste buds located in the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. This pathway starts with special sensory fibers in the tongue that travel via lingual branches of cranial nerve 9 to the inferior glossopharyngeal or petrosal ganglion, which contains the cell bodies of these first-order neurons in the jugular foramen. Then, the fibers enter the cranial cavity and reach the brainstem at the level of the rostral medulla. From here, they travel in the solitary tract and synapse in the gustatory part of the nucleus of the solitary tract on a second-order neuron to let us know that the strawberry is, indeed, yummy. Next up is the visceral sensory component, which receives sensory information from the baroreceptors of the carotid sinus and the chemoreceptors of the carotid body, as well as the mucosa of the oropharynx and the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. Fibers from the carotid body and sinus join with the sensory fibers from the tongue and the pharyngeal plexus. Somatic sensory fibers typically travel to the superior glossopharyngeal ganglion and synapse in the spinal trigeminal nucleus. Meanwhile, visceral and special sensory fibers typically travel to the inferior glossopharyngeal ganglion and synapse in the nucleus of the solitary tract. Next, there's the branchial motor component of the glossopharyngeal nerve, which innervates the stylopharyngeus muscle. This is a muscle in the pharynx that elevates it during swallowing and speaking. The branchial motor pathway starts from the motor cortex, and its axons travel to the nucleus ambiguus located in the medulla, containing cell bodies of the lower motor neurons. After they emerge from the medulla, they join the other components of CN9 to exit the skull via the jugular foramen. Finally, they descend deep to the styloid process and wrap around the posterior border of the stylopharyngeus muscle to innervate it. Now, let's take a look at the gag reflex, which helps prevent objects in the oral cavity from entering the throat and also helps prevent choking. This reflex has an afferent limb supplied by the glossopharyngeal nerve and an efferent limb supplied by the vagus nerve. Now, this pathway starts with stimulation of the posterior pharyngeal wall, the tonsillar area, or the base of the tongue, which sends signals to the glossopharyngeal nerve that carries this information to the superior glossopharyngeal ganglion located in the jugular foramen. Then, these neurons send fibers to the nucleus ambiguus, and from here, efferent nerve fibers are sent through the vagus nerve to the pharyngeal muscles, which results in bilateral contraction of the posterior pharyngeal muscles. Finally, the parasympathetic component of CN9 provides innervation to the parotid gland. This pathway starts with preganglionic fibers that originate from the inferior salivatory nucleus located in the upper medulla. These fibers exit the brainstem along with the other parts of CN9 and enter the jugular foramen. Then, they travel through both the superior and inferior glossopharyngeal ganglia without synapsing and exit the inferior ganglion as the tympanic nerve. The tympanic nerve then enters the petrous portion of the temporal bone and ascends to the tympanic cavity where it contributes to the tympanic plexus. The parasympathetic fibers pass through this plexus and join to become the lesser petrosal nerve, which emerges in the middle cranial fossa and then exits the skull through the foramen ovale. After exiting the skull, the lesser petrosal nerve synapses in the otic ganglion, and postganglionic fibers from the otic ganglion travel with the auriculotemporal branch of cranial nerve V3 to the parotid gland. Alright, as a quick recap. The glossopharyngeal nerve is the ninth cranial nerve, and its functions include somatic sensory, visceral sensory, special sensory, branchial motor, and parasympathetic innervation. It provides branchial motor innervation to the stylopharyngeus muscle, special sensory innervation to the posterior third of the tongue, visceral sensory information for the carotid sinus and the carotid body, the mucosa of the oropharynx, the palatine tonsil, and the soft palate, and parasympathetic innervation to the parotid gland. The glossopharyngeal nerve also plays an important role in the gag reflex.
The vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve, and its name comes from the Latin word vagare, which means indefinite or wandering. This actually reflects its wide distribution, seeing as the vagus nerve is the most extensively distributed cranial nerve. In fact, it innervates structures all the way from the head and neck to parts of the digestive tract. The vagus nerve has multiple functions, such as somatic, visceral, and special sensory innervation, as well as somatic and visceral motor innervation. Now, the vagus nerve emerges from the lateral medulla through a group of rootlets that join and leave the cranium through the jugular foramen, along with cranial nerves 9 and 11, or the glossopharyngeal and spinal accessory nerves. Both left and right vagus nerves leave the cranium through the jugular foramen on their respective sides and penetrate the carotid sheath. Then they descend within the carotid sheath, posterior to the common carotid artery and medial to the internal jugular vein. From here, each vagus nerve takes a different course as they enter the thorax. The right vagus nerve crosses the right subclavian artery anteriorly, runs posterior to the superior vena cava, and descends posterior to the right main bronchus to contribute to the cardiac, pulmonary, and esophageal plexuses. When it reaches the lower part of the esophagus, it forms the posterior vagal trunk and then enters the abdomen through the esophageal hiatus of the diaphragm. The left vagus nerve, on the other hand, enters the thorax between the left common carotid artery and the left subclavian artery and descends on the aortic arch. Then it runs posterior to the left main bronchus, contributing to the cardiac, pulmonary, and esophageal plexuses. And finally, it continues to form the anterior vagal trunk and enters the abdomen through the esophageal hiatus. In the abdomen, the vagal trunks terminate by dividing into branches that contribute to various plexuses which supply the visceral organs of the abdomen up to approximately the last third of the transverse colon. Over its course, both the right and left vagus nerves give off a number of branches, such as the pharyngeal branches, the recurrent laryngeal nerves, and the superior laryngeal nerves, which then further divide into the internal and external laryngeal nerves. All of these branches provide branchial motor innervation to the muscles of the fourth and sixth pharyngeal arches. Remember that the pharyngeal arches are 6 embryological structures, of which only 5 eventually develop into various muscles, arteries, bones, and cartilage of the head and neck. Structures derived from the fourth pharyngeal arch include the cricothyroid muscle, all muscles of the pharynx, except for the stylopharyngeus, and all muscles of the palate, except the tensor veli palatini, as well as the thyroid and epiglottic cartilages of the larynx. The structures of the fourth arch are all innervated by the superior laryngeal nerves and pharyngeal branches of vagus. Structures derived from the sixth pharyngeal arch include all the intrinsic muscles of the larynx, except the cricothyroid muscle, as well as the cricoid and arytenoid cartilages of the larynx. The structures of the sixth arch are innervated by the recurrent laryngeal nerves. Now, the recurrent laryngeal nerves are called so because they run in the opposite direction from the vagus nerve, meaning that while the vagus descends into the thorax, the recurrent laryngeal nerves ascend back towards the larynx. Now, the course of the right and left recurrent laryngeal nerves back towards the larynx is slightly different. The left recurrent laryngeal nerve crosses under the arch of the aorta at the ligamentum arteriosum and ascends between the trachea and the esophagus, while the right recurrent laryngeal nerve hooks around the right subclavian artery and ascends in the neck between the trachea and the esophagus. Once in the neck, both nerves pass posterior to the thyroid gland and enter the larynx. So together, the superior laryngeal, pharyngeal, and the recurrent laryngeal branches of the vagus nerve provide branchial motor innervation to the majority of the muscles of the palate, pharynx, and the larynx, which are mainly involved in swallowing and phonation. The superior laryngeal nerve also provides sensory information, specifically via the internal laryngeal nerve, from the structures of the larynx located above the vocal folds, such as the epiglottis, the base of the tongue, the epiglottic glands, and the mucous membrane surrounding the entrance of the larynx. Sensory information from all the structures below the vocal folds travels via the recurrent laryngeal nerves. Now let's look at how the vagus nerve, along with the glossopharyngeal nerve, participate in the gag reflex. The gag reflex prevents foreign objects in the oral cavity from unintentionally entering the throat and also helps prevent choking. This reflex has an afferent limb supplied by the glossopharyngeal nerve and an efferent limb supplied by the vagus nerve. Now, this pathway starts with stimulation of the posterior pharyngeal wall, the tonsillar area, or the base of the tongue, which sends signals via the glossopharyngeal nerve that carries this information to the superior glossopharyngeal ganglion located in the jugular foramen. Then, these first-order neurons send fibers to the nucleus ambiguus, from which efferent nerve fibers travel through the vagus nerve to the pharyngeal muscles, which results in bilateral contraction of the posterior pharyngeal muscles. Let's take a quick break and try to remember which structures are derived from the fourth versus the sixth pharyngeal arches. Now that we understand the general pathway of the vagus nerve as a whole, let's look more specifically into the course of the different motor and sensory fibers of the vagus nerve, starting off with somatic or branchial motor fibers. This pathway begins in the cerebral cortex, where axons travel and synapse in the nucleus ambiguus, located in the medulla, which is where the cell bodies of the lower motor neurons in this motor pathway are found. Efferent fibers, arising from the nucleus ambiguus, then emerge from the medulla and travel through the vagus nerve and its branches to the muscles of the fourth and sixth pharyngeal arches. The vagus nerve also has somatic sensory fibers, which provide general sensory information to the mucosa of the larynx, some of the dura mater surrounding the posterior cranial fossa, a small section of skin of the external ear, as well as the posterior-inferior aspect of the external auditory canal and tympanic membrane. This pathway starts with somatic sensory fibers from these structures traveling through the vagus nerve, including the auricular branch of the vagus nerve for the structures of the ear, to the inferior or superior vagal ganglion. Now, the cell bodies of the first-order neurons for the general sensation from the larynx are found in the inferior vagal ganglion, while the cell bodies of the first-order neurons for the general sensation from the ear and dura mater are found in the superior vagal ganglion. From here, The fibers project to and synapse in the spinal trigeminal nucleus located in the medulla, which is where the cell bodies of the second-order neurons in the vagal nerve general sensory pathway are found. Next up are the visceral sensory fibers, which receive sensory information from the mucosa of the laryngopharynx, the larynx, the aortic body chemoreceptors, as well as the thoracic and abdominal viscera. These fibers, which are first-order neurons in the vagal nerve visceral sensory pathway, travel through the inferior vagal ganglion where their cell bodies are found. They then project towards and eventually synapse in the nucleus of the solitary tract, which is where the cell bodies of the secondary neurons are found. Now don't forget that the vagus nerve also carries special sensory information to the brain. This pathway starts with special sensory fibers in the epiglottic region and the laryngopharynx that travel via the vagus nerve to the inferior vagal ganglion, where the cell bodies of these first-order neurons are found. Then they exit the jugular foramen and reach the brainstem at the level of the rostral medulla. From here, the fibers travel in the solitary tract and synapse in the gustatory part of the nucleus of the solitary tract, where the cell bodies of second-order neurons in this pathway are found. Finally, the vagus nerve also carries parasympathetic fibers, which provide visceral motor innervation to the involuntary muscles and glands of the tracheobronchial tree, the esophagus, the heart, and the digestive tract as far as the last third of the transverse colon. This pathway starts with preganglionic fibers that originate from the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve, which is located in the medulla. Then the fibers travel through the vagus nerve and synapse at various ganglia located close to or in the walls of different thoracic and abdominal target organs. Finally, postganglionic fibers will travel and synapse directly onto the target organs. All right, as a quick recap, the vagus nerve is the 10th and most widely distributed cranial nerve in the body. It's composed of a variety of different motor and sensory fibers. First off, the vagus nerve, specifically the superior laryngeal, pharyngeal, and recurrent laryngeal branches, provide branchial or somatic motor innervation to the muscles of the 4th and 6th pharyngeal arches, which include the majority of the muscles of the palate, pharynx, and larynx. The vagus nerve also carries somatic sensory information from the larynx, some of the dura mater surrounding the posterior cranial fossa, and a small section of skin of the external ear. Visceral sensory information is carried from the mucosa of the laryngopharynx and the larynx, the aortic body chemoreceptors, as well as the thoracic and abdominal organs, and special sensory or taste information comes from the epiglottic region and the laryngopharynx. Finally, the vagus nerve has parasympathetic fibers that innervate the majority of the thoracic and abdominal viscera.
The spinal accessory nerve, or the 11th cranial nerve, and the hypoglossal nerve, or the 12th cranial nerve, are two purely motor cranial nerves that innervate muscles in the neck, as well as the tongue. Specifically, the spinal accessory nerve provides somatic motor innervation to the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles, while the hypoglossal nerve provides somatic motor innervation to almost all the muscles of the tongue. Let's start with the spinal accessory nerve. The somatic motor pathway of the spinal accessory nerve starts in the cerebral cortex. Then, the axons travel to the spinal accessory nucleus, which is located in the cervical spinal cord, specifically in the posterolateral aspect of the anterior horn. The axons travel through the rootlets from the first 5 or 6 cervical segments of the spinal cord and form the spinal accessory nerve. The spinal accessory nerve ascends through the foramen magnum, enters the posterior cranial fossa, and then exits through the jugular foramen. It continues its journey down along the internal carotid artery and runs deep to the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which it supplies. Then, it emerges from the sternocleidomastoid muscle through its posterior border and continues inferiorly in the posterior triangle of the neck to reach and supply the trapezius muscle through multiple branches. The spinal accessory nerve is located superficially in the posterior triangle of the neck, and you can identify it using 2 landmarks. 1/3 of the way down from the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid muscle and 1/3 of the way up from the anterior border of the trapezius muscle. Now, let's switch gears and look at the hypoglossal nerve, which supplies all the muscles of the tongue, except the paladoglossus. The somatic motor pathway of the hypoglossal nerve starts in the cerebral cortex. Then, the axons travel to the hypoglossal nucleus located in the medulla, and arise as the hypoglossal nerve from rootlets along the medulla and exit the cranium through the hypoglossal canal. After exiting the cranium, the hypoglossal nerve runs inferiorly, posterior to the mandible, and loops around a branch from the external carotid artery, called the occipital artery. Around the angle of the mandible, it curves anteriorly and travels deep to the posterior belly of the digastric muscle and enters the oral cavity. Once in the oral cavity, it runs on the floor lateral to the tongue and can be found running with the lingual vein, lateral to the hyoglossus muscle. Along its path in the oral cavity, it gives branches to supply the muscles of the tongue, with the exception of the palatoglossus muscle, which is innervated by the vagus nerve instead. A final note about the hypoglossal nerve: during its course within the neck, nerve fibers from the C1 spinal nerve hitch a ride with the hypoglossal nerve to supply muscles associated with the hyoid bone. Most of these fibers form part of the ansa cervicalis, which is a nerve loop that is part of the cervical plexus, and it innervates most of the infrahyoid muscles. A separate branch of the C1 spinal nerve hitchhikes along cranial nerve 12 to innervate the thyrohyoid and geniohyoid muscles. Alright, as a quick recap, the spinal accessory nerve is the 11th cranial nerve, and it has only a motor function to supply the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles. The hypoglossal nerve is the 12th cranial nerve, and it has only a motor function to supply all the muscles of the tongue except the palatoglossus muscle. C1 fibers also travel with it to supply the infrahyoid muscles and one suprahyoid muscle.